Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and before we get started today, I want to load up a question one of my Patreon supporters had about this game, as Juan Bourbano asked, who in their right mind believed this was appropriate to release as a finished game? Yeah, if you've never heard of One Must Fall Battlegrounds, there's a lot of reasons for that. You can see from the footage right now, this doesn't look anything like the original One Must Fall 2097, and quite frankly, this game has a lot of issues, some of which were ultimately patched out, others of which tie in with the design rather than being an actual bug, some of which actually are bugs, and some of which don't even technically have anything to do with the game itself, but rather how the game was treated up to and following release. And I should know, I was there, experiencing it as it happened. Heck, I was rummaging through my boxes and storage and found my original box for this game, which I bought literally 2 or 3 days after it came out. And yeah, I spent $60 on this. I was seriously hyped for this thing, as were a lot of people. But when I got home and tried to play it, I literally got 2 matches in, and the game soft-locked on a loading screen, and would continue to do so every single time I tried to play more than a couple or 3 matches in a row. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go over some basic details about the game. It is developed by Divergence Entertainment, basically the business name for Rob Ellum, the original creator of One Must Fall 2097. In fact, he even published it primarily on his own accord. Epic Mega Games had surprisingly little to do with this one. Rob did try to get them to license out the Unreal Engine to run the game, but at the time, licensing out engines was not a common practice, especially for engines still in the works. So instead, this game runs on its own engine. I should also point out that this game spent 7 years in development, coming out around the end of 2003, which would be a very long development cycle for a large company, but as I understand it, surprisingly few people actually worked on this game. Primarily Rob himself on the design and code, while one Kevin Bird did most of the art and assets. So when all is said and done, and this really is just an indie game disguised as a full commercial product. Now, let's talk about some positive aspects about this game, because it's not all bad, far from it. For instance, the graphics are actually pretty well done for a 2003 game, considering the limitations of graphics hardware at the time. The engine itself has a number of special effects not common for PC games of this era, such as environmental mapping and glowing lights, plus the polygon counts are fairly high, in fact maybe a little too high, but we'll get into that in a bit. The music is also incredibly well done. I do miss the fact that almost none of the original music got remixed for this game, save for the title music, but the music system is adaptive, able to string various pieces together based on how well a battle is going, providing more uplifting and triumphant parts when you're doing well, and providing more intense and foreboding parts when you're getting your butt handed to you. All tied in with how early or late in a battle it is. And none of the music is bad, all of it fits the game very well, so that's one aspect of this game they got very right. The raw gameplay itself can be a little wonky because of how hard it is to judge distance, but it ultimately doesn't play that bad. You have controls for moving forward, backward, and turning left and right. You have left and right punches and kicks, an evade button, and a jump button. Because of the nature of the controls and having full 3D movement, there's a lot of simplicity in what you can do regardless of which robot you're piloting. And even though there's a lot of possible ways to move and dodge, almost every robot follows the same basic scheme. The drawback, of course, is that this does kind of make each bot feel less unique and more generic. Although you can also speed up time whenever you're not actually controlling a robot by holding down any of your action keys. The more you hold down at once, the faster time will move, thus providing a good way to advance through dialogue you don't care about or point towards in certain modes. But now, let's talk about this game's many issues, and we're going to start with a couple which hit home before people were even able to play this game. The first are the robots. The original OMF had 11 robots to choose from, each of which had very unique designs and capabilities. In fact, the original plans for an OMF sequel were to just take the original game and expand upon it while giving it a high-resolution overhaul. But with the push to make everything 3D in the late 90s, that didn't happen. To compensate for the major shift in design and to take advantage of the mechanics being planned, only 5 of the original robots made the cut. The Jaguar, Katana, Pyros, Kronos, and Gargoyle. And most of them don't look anything like their original counterparts, nor do any of them really play like their original counterparts either. The remaining 3 robots created specifically for this game are the Mantis, Warlord, and Force, all 3 of whom have greater emphasis on generating and using carryable objects to assist in combat. though the Chronos was also given these features too. But think about this for a second. Only 8 robots instead of 11? How many fighting game sequels can you think of where the number of playable characters is reduced compared to the original? Not many, that's for sure. While the game was in the works, we were routinely being teased about old robots being remade and about the new robots, and even back then, we weren't all on board with the redesigns. Well, yeah, they looked cool, but nostalgia doesn't work unless there's a way to connect to things visually or audibly. To us, these remade robots only had the names of the old ones and no nostalgia at all. Then the game came out, and we all rushed out and bought it without first taking a look at the system requirements. I have my jewel case for the CD here, and we can read through them together. Now, this game runs very poorly on minimum specs. In fact, it's borderline unplayable, so we're going to go by recommended specs to get an idea of what this game needs to run properly. Firstly, a 1 GHz CPU is recommended. Well, that's not that bad for 2003. That'd be above average, but only by a little. Next, we have a recommendation of 256 megabytes of RAM. This one is kinda high, specifically because systems with more than 512 megabytes were only just starting to reach consumers, since Windows 98 couldn't handle more than that, and Windows XP was still brand new. So 256 would be on the high side of what the average person would have, but it's still not outrageous. But then we get to the video card. It doesn't say what kind of GPU to have, but recommends that it have 128 megabytes of video RAM. That would be top of the line for the time. That would be the best GeForce 3s or 4s you could find. A lot of people love to joke about, can it run Crysis? Well, can it run One Must Fall Battlegrounds is just as valid an argument. Except where Crysis actually looked spectacular for the GPU power it was pushing, this game just has neat little effects added to objects and arenas which are using way more polygons than they probably should. Most of the GPU power is actually sucked up by the special effects over the robots themselves, so on period correct systems, you typically would have an okay frame rate most of the time, which would die the moment any heavy action started occurring. So yeah, having fairly low frame rates didn't help matters, but the fact that the initial release of the game locked up frequently between rounds just added to the aggravation. In fact, the loading times are already around a solid minute long at the time, so it was hard to know if the game was just taking a little longer to load than it should, or if it's just totally locked up. Naturally, the devs had to roll out patches to deal with this. Many patches. In fact, so many patches that it kind of became a bit of a joke. The game itself has a launcher for auto-patching, which naturally the servers don't exist for anymore, but because of the sheer number of patches, all of which were designed to patch specific version numbers to specific version numbers, actually patching this game up nowadays can be a bit of a nightmare. I'll talk more about what patches tend to work out the best in a little, but be prepared for dealing with this nonsense. And as for the game itself, fully patched up and ready to play, it still has its share of design problems. Let's start with the most obvious one. This game has way fewer features than the original in terms of single-player play. There's no tournament mode to build a custom character through, and there's no standard gameplay mode where you just fight a bunch of battles in a row. Instead, the single-player mode has you select pre-made challenge runs and tournaments to go through, where your choice of character or robot is limited. And many of these are locked or even completely invisible at first, so the very first time I saw this screen, my initial reaction was, that's it? Really, over half of these single-player challenges aren't even revealed to the player until they pass other challenges first. Plus, when you go to choose a robot, you're stuck using the color presets of whatever character you chose to play as. Though at least there's different texturings for each robot, so it's not totally uncustomizable. Actually, there's one minor thing which bugs me is that for all of the characters who jumped from the original game to here, none of their portraits look anything like their originals. In fact, many of their personalities and the dialogue have also changed considerably too. And again, it's like the only thing this game has in common with the original is the names of everything. The next issue is one that severely hurts the replayability, and that there's no character-based dialogue anymore. When you go through the various challenges in the single-player mode, there's still character banter before combat begins and between matches, but whenever you have a choice of character to play as, they stay totally silent and never say a word, meaning the banter is identical every single time you play through the game. And one of the ways in which fighting games encourage varying your character selections is by offering different dialogue and endings. Even the original One Must Fall was like this. But here, there's no variation, and thus no reason whatsoever to replay any of the challenges that you've already completed. But now, we get to the two biggest issues this game has, which are so incredibly big, it makes getting through the single player challenges nearly impossible. The first is the cheating. Half of the single player matches in this game involve opponents cheating. Now, one could argue that this spices things up and makes the matches more interesting, and on the occasions when the cheats affect everyone in the match, that's fine. But most of the time the cheats only benefit a single character, making them way more powerful, and in the process, nearly unbeatable. In fact, the way to win when cheating occurs is to abuse the game mechanics in some way. For instance, in this damage scoring based battle, Steel Claw has infinite energy and is thus able to spam his super moves, thus no matter what, he's always going to be racking up tons and tons of points if you try to go in and fight him. So the way you win is to just not fight him at all. Let him punish one of the other guys in the fight while you constantly go after whoever's the closest to you. This way, Steel Claw can never hit multiple opponents at the same time with his supers, thus giving you an opportunity to keep your points evened out fairly well. This is literally the only way to win, and almost completely negates having to have a fighter cheat, since you win by not fighting him directly. And half of the single player mode is like this. It's just, I want to play a fighting game to fight stuff, not puzzle solve the game mechanics. That alone severely curtails the fun factor of this game. But the biggest issue of all is that the game features adaptive difficulty. Now, not adaptive AI, because that would be kind of cool if the game did that, but no, adaptive difficulty. Basically, no matter what difficulty level you select from the options screen, the game difficulty scales whenever you win or lose a match based on the gap in health between the winners and losers. If there's not that much of a gap, the difficulty stays where it is. But part of the problem is that the different difficulty levels scale very quickly. Going up just one level of difficulty can make a massive difference in how well the AI times its attacks, its counters, and just everything really. And the other part of the problem is that once you know that this is happening, sometimes the only way to win is to abuse it. Now let me show you a couple examples. Here's the fight against Raven at the end of the North American Open tournament. In this first round here, I pretty much dominate him, which in turn causes the difficulty setting to increase in the background. In the next round, despite not fighting any differently, he dominates me instead, which causes the difficulty to decrease. Thus, in the next round, I once again dominate him. If, however, I only barely lost that second round there, the difficulty wouldn't have gone back down, meaning I'd be fighting the third round with that same increased difficulty, and I'd probably lose again and have to redo the entire match. Just to demonstrate how broken the difficulty scaling itself is, later in the IFL Cup you have a 3-on-2 match, with you on the team of 3. Now the game's set up so that the team of 2 is given a difficulty level boost to compensate for this imbalance, so naturally the dialogue makes it seem as though we're just gonna wreck them. But guess what happens? They wreck us, consistently without failure. The problem is that the spike in difficulty for the opponents basically makes it so that they inflict way more damage than my team does, so my teammates just might as well not even exist. There was one point in the battle where 2 of us ganged up on one, while the other 2 fighters had their own little one-on-one going on. When our guy lost that little one-on-one and the opponent came to help his friend, said opponent still had about 90% of his health left. That is how broken the difficulty is in this game, and having it adapt to how well you do just makes it so that sometimes the best way to get further is to just throw a fight, so that the difficulty will just go back down so you can actually stand a chance again. It's so broken that it often makes playing through the single player mode a chore rather than being fun, since you're constantly having to try and decide if the difficulty's gotten too tough to win against, and then throw the fight early to bring it back down. It's stupid. I mean, this is why we have a difficulty selector in games to begin with, to set how we want to play, not have the game decide for us mid-battle that we need to get wrecked only to keep wrecking us because it didn't wreck us hard enough. Adaptive difficulty was a neat idea in theory, but the poor execution of it means you often find yourself abusing that mechanic rather than actually enjoying the challenge provided, since the challenge often spikes too hard, too fast, and may not go back down following. Anyways, let's talk about actually obtaining this game, for those of you who are morbidly curious. Firstly, it's rare. I mean really rare. I found only a tiny handful of copies when I searched for it online, and the cheapest of those was $50. As far as I'm aware, the game did not sell well at all, especially given that work on the game just sort of died out as more and more players got disenfranchised with their purchase. So, obtaining the game nowadays, not so easy. However, once you do get it, since it uses DirectX 8, it's pretty easy to get running on modern systems. Although it doesn't handle widescreen resolutions very well, nor does it have built-in windowing support. So if you want to run the game in a window at the correct aspect ratio, you're still going to need to use DxWind. But the only real setup you'll need to do with DxWind is to set it to run on a window, set the screen resolution in the game to your window size, and you also need to hook in direct input, using the checkbox that I'm indicating on the screen here. Otherwise, certain aspects of the controls aren't going to work properly. And I do also like that I was able to force it to use 4x anti-aliasing with my GTX 1070 card, which made the graphics just that much better. However, there's a few other things to keep in mind. Firstly, chances are you're going to try to run the game and nothing will happen. Guess what? That's the DRM, which doesn't work properly on modern Windows systems. So yeah, basically, you're going to need a no CD crack to get the game working. There's tons of them out there, but you're going to have to make sure you download one which matches the version number of your copy of the game, and that's where things get a little annoying. See, you're going to need to patch the game, but to figure out what version you have to run the game and go to the help screen, then load up the system description to see the build number, because there's no other way to do it. So, kinda hard to do when the game isn't running properly. Now, fresh copies of the game should have the original build number of 2090. Unless there was a later stamping of the discs with a higher version number, but I don't think that's the case, so you can probably assume that that's what you're going to be starting with. Anyways, there's no direct way to go from the original build to the final stable build, but I found the simplest way to get it there is to download the 2090 to 2151 patch, and then the 2151 to 2172 patch, with version 2172 being the final stable build. There's also beta builds which were in the works prior to development being halted, but I don't know much about them nor how to obtain them. So if anyone has any info on those, as well as if they work better or worse than the stable builds, feel free to let everyone know in the comments, and I might even add the info to the video description. Once the game is patched, then you can apply your no CD crack, and it should run fine. Except you might end up with a totally white screen for the gameplay. This is actually really easy to solve. Just go into the options and turn off the glow effect, as the way it's done is incompatible with modern graphics cards. And as you can see, poof, instantly solves the problem. Anywho, that's One Must Fall Battlegrounds. This game could have been way better than it ended up being, if not for some poor design decisions, excessive system requirements, and the numerous bugs which plagued the game when it first came out. Now I'm told it's better multiplayer than it is single player because of all of this, so that's actually the way I would recommend playing it if you want to experience it the best way possible. Just good luck finding players. Though, believe it or not, there is still an active forum for the game out there, so I'll post a link to that in the video description if anyone wants to try their luck finding people there to play against. And that's all for today's filler. Only one more filler to go to round out the year, which will be coming out on Saturday, December 23rd. And we'll be finishing off our look at the Windows sequels to DOS games with one more 3D game. Except, unlike every game so far, which have been 3D games which play in 3 dimensions, this is a 3D game which plays in 2 dimensions. Yeah, one of those. So if you're thinking of which game that could be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned to see a game which I personally feel is extremely underrated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.